I didn't realize until just now that I have papers with large print. I didn't realize it's on the screen here. So if I can read off the screen, I won't have to hold the papers up. But this is larger font. So we'll just see how it goes. I am really grateful and appreciate the opportunity to be here. How many of you have heard of the Nebraska City Cutoff Trail? Just raise your hand. This isn't a class, but just raise your hand. Okay, most everybody. And before Gene today, how many had heard of Wyoming, Nebraska Territory? Okay, about the same. My talk, or my thoughts today, center on that. I'm going to use the big print. So, I didn't know any of this about, I didn't know where the Nebraska City Cutoff Trail was. I didn't know anything about Wyoming, Nebraska Territory until Gail Hymas and Terry Lady got us started. A gentleman named Michael Landon from the Church History Library said, you got to go back to Omaha. So we did. Marilyn and I came back here in 2012, and Gail Hymas and Terry Lady, we met upstairs in the little glass office, and they told us how to get to Wyoming, Nebraska Territory. Well, not Nebraska Territory anymore, Wyoming, Nebraska, old Wyoming. Go down 75. He told us the name of the fellow who owned the farm. So from there, Marilyn and I got in our car, we drove down Highway 75. We met with Jim and Harold Johnson, who were then farming the land. And it was just off from there. It's been a wonderful, wonderful process of discovery. Between the years 1864 to 1866, over 7,000 members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints used Wyoming, Nebraska Territory and the Nebraska City Cutoff Trail in their trek to Utah. Many of the saints who immigrated in the 1860s, they traveled over 6,000 miles. Can you imagine leaving your home and going to a land where nobody spoke the language you speak, and you get to a place that's, we'll talk about in just a minute, Wyoming. It wasn't a real super place at the time that these immigrants, these saints came here. They didn't speak the language. It was a tough go, but they did it because their faith was strong in the principle of the gathering, which was preached by Brigham Young. Okay, so how do I go to the next slide? Bottom. Okay. Thank you. Jacob Dawson, along with 5 other men, to set the stage for the migration of the 3 years between 1864 and 1866, I'm going to give a brief detail of Wyoming, Nebraska Territory and the Nebraska City Cutoff Trail, because they're a part and parcel to that, to their migration. So a gentleman named Jacob Dawson, with 5 other men, filed a plat for the town of Wyoming, Nebraska Territory on the 26th of August, 1856. Now, if you're playing a basketball game against another team, would you look at the other team, say they had 10 players and you're playing 5-on-5, would you invite 5 of the other team players to play on your team and have a game? Who's going to win? The other team's going to win. Here's what Jacob Dawson did. It's amazing. The 5 men that he chose to be his partners all lived in Nebraska City. 3 of them were attorneys, 1 of them was a banker, and 1 of them was a surveyor. Their intent was to stop Wyoming, Nebraska Territory from advancing. Why? Because Nebraska City was only 7 miles south. Here's a letter. One of the gentlemen that was partners with Jacob Dawson wrote the following in a letter in 1874. Quote, in 1856, the proprietors of Nebraska City, fearing that the town of Wyoming would eclipse Nebraska City, concluded to buy that town, but they did not pay much for it. So their intent was to stop Jacob Dawson, and it worked. He had so many grandiose, wonderful ideas, and we're going to talk about that right now. When his town was only a few months old, so this would have been in probably October and November of 1856, Dawson advertised in the Wyoming Post, which was his own newspaper. He advertised for 50 day laborers, 20 carpenters to come to Wyoming. In the same article, Dawson said they had a call for shoemakers, tinners, saddlers, and tradesmen. Why? In the hyperbole of trying to get people to come, and this happened a lot, and the western towns were trying to be formed, you kind of built things up more than they actually were. You made it sound better than it actually is. What's amazing is that the very newspaper that Dawson owned and that he printed, he used the printing press from Orson Hyde. He bought Orson Hyde's Frontier, Guardian, and printing press in 1852 when the people out of Canesville, Council Bluffs, were commanded to go west. That's amazing. How everything interlocks. Now, this is a view of Wyoming, Nebraska territory. I keep saying territory. This is a view of Wyoming in 2012. It was a state then. It's just amazing. The fields and the area that's there. This is another view looking east towards the Missouri River. Now, when Wyoming was established, the Missouri River was running right by the town. In 1864, Wyoming, Nebraska territory was selected over Florence for the new outfitting station for the church. Florence, as was told about yesterday, for several years was used by the church. Even as late as February 1864, Brigham Young, in a letter to Bishop Edward Hunter, said that Florence was still going to be used. Joseph A. Young and Joseph W. Young. Joseph A. Young was Brigham Young's son. Joseph W. Young was appointed as the overseer for the immigration of 1864. They arrived in Omaha 1 a.m. In the morning. On a particular morning, they had met earlier at Kearney. They traveled to Omaha. They determined to go down and look at Wyoming, Nebraska, and see what they had there. Here are the reasons that Joseph A. Young says that the move was made. And I'm just going to read them. It's the best steamboat landing I know of on the river. This is Joseph A. Young. Second, a high, dry, hilly country surrounding the village. You've seen that in the past couple of pictures. Third, the settlers were scarce. There was very little left in Wyoming by the time 1864 came. It also avoided the Elkhorn and Loup Forks of the Platte River, making it less river to cross. And the number 5 reason they used was a kinder spirit among the people. There were not as many apostates there. And that was the wording and the reasoning that was used. Now, this is the levee looking south. What's left of the levee? There's mobile homes there now, people's summer plant locations. Sometime during the history of Wyoming, Nebraska territory, a cemetery was established. Now, fortunately, Jim took us around to where the cemetery is, but this is all that's left of the tombstones. And that's been talked about and alluded to later, or in earlier conversations today and yesterday. They just get destroyed. Now, the Jim Johnson and his dad, along with the John Watts Barrett family genealogical organization, put this together, and this is on the property of Jim Johnson. So that's a little background on Wyoming. Now let's talk about the Nebraska City Cutoff Trail. Like other parts of the country in the mid-1850s, Nebraska City was mired in an economic slump. They needed a stimulus. That stimulus for them was the Utah War of 1857. The freighting firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell won the contract, the government contract to haul freight west to Utah. They determined that Nebraska City would be the location where they shipped, the terminus for the freight that they would ship west. The amount of freight they shipped in 1858 was 16 million pounds of freight to support the Utah War that fortunately didn't end with much bloodshed. Fortunately, and also at this point in time, the Nebraska City Cutoff Trail was not yet established. So they had to go up and use the Oxbow Trail, which approached the Platte River with a lot of the muddy bottoms, and then it would blend back down. Here's I find this really interesting. The Cutoff Trail, roughly 15,000 people use the Cutoff Trail from its establishment. It was established in 1860. It was an important factor in the development of population south of the Platte River. As we've heard earlier, Omaha was the king. The capital, of the territory was here. Much more population was here. The Nebraska City Cutoff Trail had an impact on that and helped and attracted more population. Whoops, I want to go back. The political control of the South of the southern part of Nebraska took place. The Nebraska City Trail influenced that to a large degree. Now, I find these numbers mind-boggling. And these are accurate numbers if what you read in the Nebraska City newspapers of 1864 and 1865 are accurate. Look at these numbers. 23 million pounds of freight shipped from Nebraska City in 1864. The largest year of freight volume was the next year, over 44 million pounds of freight shipped over that trail out of Nebraska City. And in the newspaper article, it tells you it took over 4,000 wagons, over 3,000 men, and 35,850 oxen. Now, my mind went to the fact that the buffalo is gone now, but the saints who used the trail in 1864, 65, and 66 would have had opportunity to have plenty of oxen chips and not buffalo chips. That's likely what they used, because there were no trees. One of the fascinating stories about Nebraska City Cutoff Trail is what took place on July 14th, 1862. This is a kind of a murky picture, but a gentleman named John Renshaw Brown unloaded this massive wagon that they wanted to ship freight with. It stood over 10 feet tall, the wheels stood over 10 feet tall, and it would go 2.5 miles an hour. Now, what this could do, or what they hoped it could do, was to ship freight from Nebraska City to Denver in 4 days. Now, keep in mind that during this time, the amount of time it took to get from Nebraska City to Denver using oxen was 28 days. So a huge reduction in cost and time. You can see why they wanted to have this be successful. Here's what happened. On the 22nd of July, 1862, the Great Steam Wagon experiment began. The steam wagon limped out of town carrying, it had 3 wagons. 2 carried 4 tons of flour, and the 3rd wagon was used as a tender for the tractor. They needed a tender for the steam-powered engine. Sadly for Mr. Brown, and for those who supported this undertaking, the giant machine ground to a halt about 3 miles out of town. There's a marker outside of town now that says this is where everything stopped. Here's what happened. It was a great idea, but what took place was the Civil War, and other things. Brown hung around Nebraska City for a while, drumming up business, getting people excited. He eventually left, never came back. What happened was a crank broke, and it could not be shipped, it couldn't be fixed, at Nebraska City. Now, we're talking about the Nebraska City Cutoff Trail. It was established in 1860. Here's a picture of the trail from a newspaper article. Now, I'm going to do my best. There's Nebraska City, and there's the trail. That top one there is the Oxbow Trail. Oh, my hand's not shaking so bad you can't see it. Did that make any sense? Or do you want to embarrass me and do it again? Okay, I'm good. Thank you. It's just amazing. And the article talks about how many trees there are along the trail, all of those things that didn't exist, but it got people pretty excited. Bottom line of the Nebraska City Cutoff Trail, it was established as a freighting trail, but it carried these saints during the 3-year period. Now, here's a map produced by David Murphy, formerly a research associate at History Nebraska. He's now retired. This shows the cutoff trail. I think it was the Intermountain Division of the Park Service did a feasibility study and has a trail that looks very close to what Dale did. I sadly didn't bring a picture. Now there's Wyoming, which is where the Saints left. And does that trail look pretty straight? It goes all over the place. Why? It's been talked about today. You go where you can go, depending on the weather, depending on all kinds of issues. Now, as you can see where it says Spring Creek Prairie right there? If you want to see ruts, untouched, unfettered ruts, you go to the Spring Creek Prairie Audubon. And it's in Minden, just west of Lincoln. If you love ruts, and I think everybody in here does, it's just beautiful. They've never been touched. And there's, coming down a hill, you can see where the ruts are. It's just a great experience. Now, regarding the trail, you can see right there, Beaver Crossing. That's where the trail blended into one trail, for the most part, for the balance of the trek on the trail itself. Now, as you go further west, the trail blended with the Oxbow Trail. That's, where's my, oh, wrong one. How many know where Doniphan, Nebraska is? Probably most of you here. That's where the trail blended with the Oxbow Trail. These are just so interesting. Now, let's talk about the migration. During 1864, approximately 2898 Latter-day Saints traveled the Utah Territory using down and back trains and independent freight trains. Now, as has been talked about, those who immigrated from Europe and from different locations overseas, when they came on these trains, wagon trains, they walked. Because the wagon trains got loaded with what? Freight. And they had X number of pounds that they could take. If they had money, they could pay extra money and take more freight. But most of them did not. So it was 7 down and back church trains, 4 independent wagon trains, and 6 freight wagon trains that hauled these almost 3,000 Saints west. Now, in 1865, there were no down and back trains. We don't know exactly why, or at least I don't. Some of the indications have been, it might have been the Black Hawk War, which was going at the time in Utah, a lack of cattle, I don't know. But there were no trains, church down and back trains sent. However, more than 700 immigrants made their way west during that year. Now, 1866 was the final year that Wyoming, Nebraska was used as an outfitting station, and 10 down and back trains picked up saints during that year. Interestingly, B.H. Roberts and Andrew Jensen both immigrated during the year 1866. And as we learned earlier today, Jens Borglum immigrated in 1864. They all used Wyoming, Nebraska territory as their resting place. That's what these locations were for. The railroad reached the North Platte, Nebraska area in 1867. That's why this is the final outfitting station on the Missouri River. It was the last year that happened. Now, one of the things I'm most excited about is to show you some pictures taken in 1866 by Charles Savage. It's the only known photographs of a cross plains migration taken during that period of time. Savage had his own special wagon. They shipped it around South America, sent it to the East Coast. He got it to Wyoming, Nebraska. I have no idea how. But he took this on his wagon, with the wagon train that he went with, that was captained by Thomas E. Ricks. He was one of the 10 down and back train masters, captains. This is a photograph of old Wyoming. I don't know, I hope you find this exciting. 1866, these are people. You see, there's a teepee there. It's probably hard to see on the slide, but there's just the wagons from the down and back train. The people that came from Europe were, for the most part, poor. So what they lived in was, if they were lucky, they had a tent. Oftentimes, they just used brush. And those of you who live in Nebraska know what it's like to have storms that Nebraska seems to produce. Now, I'm going to tell a couple of stories. How am I doing time-wise? Okay. I haven't been thinking that. This is a story about Phoebe Ann Woolley Davis. And I thank Will Bagley for the privilege of using this. She describes, she had members living in Utah Territory. Brothers, Edwin Woolley, and then she had a twin brother, and other relatives that she wanted to see. But here's what happened. In May of 1864, she, her husband Moses, and her 3 children left northeastern Ohio, filled with high hopes of seeing their woolly kin. Little did the family know that the heartbreak that awaited them on the trail. One daughter died just 4 days after arriving at Wyoming. 16 days later, her son Eli died. She writes the following words, and I hope you can feel the power of this. I don't share this because everything was death and destruction on the trail, but this is a poignant event that she wrote about as it happened. Quote, around midnight, I saw that he was going, talking about Eli. I called Moses, her husband, but Eli was gone by the time he got there. He died very easy. Stop, dear reader, and think for a moment. There, hundreds of miles from civilization, we must leave him. He lay with me in bed till 3 a.m. when he was taken out by the captain. No one can tell my feeling at the time when his little feet were dragged over me. He was taken to a tent where there was a little boy that had died the day before. They were fixed for burial. They took 2 cracker boxes. It's not a little cracker box. It's the boxes they used to haul the crackers in in the trains. Put a blanket around them, laid them on, and wrapped them around. They carried me to the grave so I might see him laid in. Here we left him a little after sunrise on the 25th of July, and we took our journey day to day. As I mentioned, no down and back trains came in 1864. The independent wagon trains were used, and some freight trains. 65, thank you. So, B.H. Roberts, as I mentioned, his mother had gone previously. That was mentioned earlier. He followed with his sister. And this is a funny event. Get to the right page. Night drives, I don't know if you know what a night drive might be, but they went at night so they can make progress. I can imagine being on a trail at night trying to move forward over rocks. So he called the night drives a terror. At the end of one of the night drives, they rested. The train was the area where they stopped was occupied by Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Roberts, like so many others on the trail, were infected with lice. The Teamsters took care of this by shearing their heads bald. So they had nothing. Here's what happened. Early in the morning, Roberts encountered a group of Native Americans sitting in a circle passing around a peace pipe. One of the Native Americans looked at Roberts' cleanly shaven head, slapped the top of his head, and said with great force, "No scalp." That's his event. Okay. I'm going to cut it a little bit short. I'm going to get 2 more stories. No, I'm going to go past this one. I want to share this story. The last wagon train to leave Wyoming, Nebraska territory left the 13th of August, 1866. It's known as the cholera train. It came from Sanpete County. The people that traveled with Abner Lowry on this train, wagon train, sailed over in the ship Cavour, and they were stricken with cholera. 17 died on the train ride from the port of New York to St. Joseph. I'll just read what happened. And then we'll look at some pictures from Charles Savage. 50 deaths occurred during the first days of this wagon train journey west. I'm just going to read how often it happened. During the first day of travel, 5 people were buried alongside the trail. On August 15th, or the day after that, 3 more deaths occurred. 4 more deaths occurred on the 16th. 2 more deaths on the 17th. 3 more on the 18th. The wagon train was still east of Fort Kearny. A total of 13 more deaths occurred before reaching Fort Kearny. Fortunately, when they reached higher elevation, the cholera subsided, as we understand. There was a rescue train in 1866. Arza Hinckley left the end of July on a mule train to find Abner Lowry's train and the Chipman down a back wagon train. He found the Lowry wagon train east of Casper. Now, if you can understand the distance from Salt Lake Valley to Casper, it took him 44 days to get there. What Arza Hinckley did was he loaded up 78 orphans or single people who were sick, and took them to the Salt Lake Valley. He was in a mule wagon train so he could go faster than the ox train. Andrew Jensen said this was one of the most pitiful occurrences in the history of the Mormon Trail. He was not discounting the Martin Willey tragedy. But in his mind, and Andrew Jensen was on a different train, a different wagon train, he felt very strongly about what these saints had. Okay, I'm going to go through the pictures and then I'll close. I want you to see these pictures because they're awesome. This is 1866. I think we saw this picture yesterday. This is called Cheese Creek Ranch. It was near Lincoln, Nebraska. It was called Cheese Creek Ranch because they sold cheese here. Can you imagine stopping there? Hey, can I pick up some cheese? It just doesn't look too inviting, but it's what they did.
Where was the health department?
That's a good question. This is a great photograph. It's called the Roland Reed Ranch. This is what helps us know that the pioneers of this time used the Nebraska City Cutoff Trail. This ranch was on the Nebraska City Cutoff Trail. It's hard to see, but you have a guy with a fiddle you can notice that the two different heights of the buildings, one has something like shingles and the other is covered with sod. It's just fascinating. Now, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln did a archaeological dig, and here's an overview of Beaver Crossing. You see where the house is? That's where the Roland Reed Ranch was, right there. And here it's marked as swale and comes out the other side. The next two pictures are that. This is going in to the Beaver Crossing. We're very grateful that Dick Parasette took us out here. It's on his land, but he had to take us a ways to get there. This is entering, and this is coming out the other side, where the wagons would fan out. It's just beautiful swales, ruts, whatever term you want to use. Here's another photograph of Fort Kearney. This is a photograph of Fort Kearney by Charles Savage. Do you see any, what do you see missing? There's no trees. There's no trees, and this fort doesn't have a whole lot of walls around it. If any of you have been to the Fort Kearney replica now, there's plenty of trees there. He took this during he called it a hurricane, so he wasn't very pleased with this picture. We showed O'Fallon's Bluff earlier today. This is an image taken by Charles Savage as they were heading west. This is crossing the Platte River. This is obviously likely the Thomas E. Ricks train because it's mules. And you can see it's not a clear picture, but it's just amazing to think that that's what these people experienced. This is Chimney Rock, one of the most famous landmarks on the trail. I don't know if that's the trail in front of it or those two where you can see the dirt, I have no idea. But that is Chimney Rock, taken by Charles Savage. Our last Charles Savage photo is in Echo Canyon, not Immigration Canyon. It's the Thomas E. Ricks train because you got Teamsters and you can see that it's mules. What a benefit it is to have someone like Charles Savage who was able to who had enough moxie, whatever term you want to use, to take pictures of a cross-plains migration that we might benefit it. All of these pictures are at History Nebraska. You can access them there. Final slide. This photo was probably 1867 because the tabernacle was done. It wasn't finished by 1866. Here's the best quote I could find about seeing the Salt Lake Valley for the first time. This is from William Grant. This is his quote. Not everybody felt positive. William Grant did. We passed through Echo Canyon and Parley's Park, Immigration Canyon, and then the beautiful city of Salt Lake burst to our views. Joy, joy. Here was to us a paradise. 5 miles brought us to the heart of the city, and we were delirious with delight. After the long voyage of 6,000 miles, they were done. That concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you.